Kyoto, Osaka, Vancouver, Mexico City, and more. It's Notebook on Cities and Culture Season 3, kickstarting on Friday, December 14th. Keep your eyes on colinmarshall.org for more information. This episode of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Practical Classics, 50 Reasons to Reread 50 Books You Haven't Touched Since High School by Kevin Smokler. Available in February, wherever fine books are sold. Season 2 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley and Daniel Murphy. Be well placed to tell me, but why has bacon so entered the zeitgeist? Why is it so popular? What do people love about bacon?
Oh, the bacon thing. The flavors of bacon make you not remember what you're eating, which is not a bad thing necessarily.
It makes you not remember, like in the moment you forget what it is. They mask what you're eating.
I think it's easy to forget that it's a pig.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think that it's salty and it's sweet and it's smoky, and yes, there's a pig-like texture to it, but of all the things you can do with pork, it's the one thing that tastes least like pork to me in a lot of ways, and I think that we're comfortable with that because we don't actually like to think about what we're eating as a pig. That said, it's become, the iconic symbol of pig in general, so it's kind of an interesting conundrum. I also think that, bacon is one of the easiest things to make at home in the world, and yet it's become this kind of exoticized, sort of culinary... There's a culinary snootiness involved with bacon now, whereas bacon is simply putting salt on a pork belly and smoking it. There's nothing hard about that whatsoever. But somehow we've sort of decided that that and pork chops basically in America are all we want to eat of the pig. And I think my problem with the bacon, you haven't asked me this, but my problem with the bacon conundrum is that it further distances us from using the whole animal and understanding how the whole animal can be used. And the more that we glorify certain parts of an animal, the less we think about how to use the whole animal. And when we don't use the whole animal, we're not really creating a very sustainable system.
It's Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting down outside here in the Pearl District in Portland, Oregon, with Camas Davis, who has been a food writer, but is now much more down into it with food. She is a founder of the Portland Meat Collective, where Portlanders of many stripes have learned how to essentially do their own butchering. They have learned. Would you say a mission of the Portland Meat Collective is to remind people, to let them know that they should never forget they are eating a pig or whatever animal it happens to be?
That's one of many missions, yes. Yeah.
And the others would include?
Creating an alternative economy of meat, one in which there's not a lot of go-betweens between the consumer and the farmer, one in which people actually have a say in how animals are slaughtered and how they're processed, and one in which people have a total and holistic understanding of what makes bacon, what makes your pork chops, and also what makes your ham, your pig snout, your ears, and why they all can be eaten and eaten well.
Now, I want to go back a bit and get some background. I mean, you had a 10-year career writing about food in Portland. Tell me what brought you to turn your eye on the world of food in the first place. I mean, what for the first segment of your career was your ambition to observe food, to analyze food culture, to write about it without a thought, to putting a hand on a side of pig at all?
Mm-hmm. I started out in the magazine world in New York, doing travel writing for National Geographic and various other magazines. And I found myself in writing about traveling to places, writing about the food, and realized that, in fact, whenever I travel, that's pretty much all I do is eat food.
So it was sort of a proxy for food writing for you, you found.
Yeah.
That's where your eye was going?
Yeah, exactly. And then I actually got a graduate degree in a little-known discipline called performance studies at NYU, and started not only doing bizarre performance art involving food, but looking into the way in which writing about food or performing food or sharing recipes or anything having to do with food can become a kind of process of witnessing when it comes to a culture's trauma or a culture's experience going through a hard time or that sort of thing. So I was studying specifically food in the Holocaust, food in Argentina during the Pinochet regime, and various kinds of very meta theoretical sorts of things that I was doing. But in the process, realized that food for me was becoming a kind of both emotional and academic vehicle for exploring the entire world. And then I ended up getting a job at Saveur magazine, the food and wine magazine that is sort of the alternative to most of the mainstream food magazines out there. And that magazine really allowed me to explore the culture of food versus just 20 ways to use a mango.
So not a kind of how-to-ism to that. There's more of a... It's more about the meaning of eating and preparation.
Yeah, the meaning, the cultural history, the, emotional connotations, all of that is what interested me, and I was lucky enough to find a magazine that allowed me to explore that. And then I came to Portland and was the food editor at a local magazine here, Portland Monthly Magazine, and that involved a lot of restaurant reviewing and service journalism, where to eat now, that kind of stuff, which was fun for a while, but also felt like it was getting away from what really interested me about food. And then I started writing articles about this sort of meat renaissance that was happening both here in Portland and also in New York when I was living there, in which you had a lot of young chefs who had either taught themselves or learned how to do whole animal butchery, and you had a lot of older butchers dying out, retiring, not passing their knowledge on, and every time I wrote an article about this, there seemed to be a real disconnect between the two parties. And then, of course, this whole sort of politicized food movement started happening in terms of the slow food movement, Alice Waters in the White House and the Victory Garden and that kind of thing. And to me, the one part of the entire food system that no one was willing to really tackle on an individual level was the world of meat. It's all fine and good to get your hands dirty and grow some vegetables, but meat people are pretty scared of. And for me personally, I had grown up hunting and fishing in Oregon. Then I became a vegetarian. Then I started eating meat again. And I had always been sort of conflicted about what it meant to eat meat from various sources. And so for me, the only way to come to terms with that conflicted nature of eating meat was to actually delve straight into that world.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but meat is now cool, like you've described. Meat was it uncool like 15, 20 years ago? It seems like meat had a prolonged uncoolness. I don't know if that's true or how long it lasted, but like meat in the 2000s and 2010s is the thing that excites eaters, where it didn't seem to that much before. Maybe I just don't know that it did.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you just look at butchers, the history of butchers in America, I think meat was a point of pride for a while, and then factory farming and industrialization happened, and it was something that a lot of butchers old school butchers and processors and slaughterhouse workers have told me they were ashamed of. They did it in secret, and rightfully so, and then I think, two things happened. One is we started in the past 10 or so years we started to question where our meat was coming from, and people started getting sick. We started getting really nervous about it, and certain farmers and butchers and chefs started thinking about, well, how can we either change this system or create an alternative system, or look to these old ways of doing things that are actually much more sustainable, that taste better. I mean, when industrialization happened, we had to cook the shit out of our meat, and it doesn't taste good. I mean, I grew up with totally chewy pork chops. I still hate pork chops to this day because of how they were cooked by my mother, But now it's like, oh yeah, if you can find good meat, safe meat that's raised well and treated well and processed well in the right way, you can cook it medium rare and suddenly it tastes so much better. So there's been this sort of like consciousness shift in terms of, how to cook meat based on where the meat comes from. But, the other thing that's happening is that there is a kind of ridiculous exoticization of meat within the culinary world, in which, like, the $100 burger happens and foie gras bonbons happen and whatever, and that's all good and fine. It tastes good, but to me that only serves to further distance us from the source. And so that's the danger in it.
This factory farming that goes on, you mentioned that the sort of the way that meat is in the main produced in America. It seems like, you, the leader of the Portland Meat Collective, and even, let's say, the hardest core animal rights vegan can agree you both hate that, right? You both hate mainstream meat production. Is that true?
Yes. Yeah.
Now, for those who don't know, for those who are completely unaware, what can you say that will turn listeners off to factory farming?
So many things. You essentially have a system by which animals are grown quickly, fed quickly, and killed quickly, on purely a flavor basis, on a purely tactile basis. Meat really doesn't taste that good when it's, a pig that's slaughtered at 6 months that's just been force-fed, soy or corn or whatever, and then is slaughtered, is watery, is pale in color, has very little flavor. In France, they wait 2 or 3 years before they slaughter an animal, and they understand that anything that's gonna taste good has to take time to grow, has to be fed well, just like vegetables, just like anything else. A store-bought tomato that's been, dyed and grown quickly isn't going to taste as good as an heirloom tomato that's taken twice as long to grow and ripen. So purely on just a sense level, factory farm meat doesn't taste as good. On a moral level, I think we all, to some extent, even if we choose to ignore it, have seen pictures of or heard tell of, and in my case, I have seen it, thousands of cattle standing in their own shit, eating corn, and I'm not going to go into the whole corn thing, but corn has its own problems. And then, moving through a slaughter facility, 1,000 per hour, if not more. There's no way that that's safe. And in fact, it's been proven that it's not safe through cases of E. coli and that sort of thing. It's also not appetizing. If anyone walked into these places, they would never want to eat meat again. And honestly, I didn't either. And I don't eat meat unless I know exactly what it's gone through and how it's raised and where it's come from. So yeah, it doesn't take much digging to figure out what's going on in that world, even if it is behind closed doors and big walls.
You talked about becoming vegetarian for a time. Was that what made you vegetarian for that time? Was this learning about that whole system that we have here?
I grew up in Eugene, Oregon, where if you aren't a vegetarian, you're really just not very cool.
So you had to be cool.
No, I did. I will say in Eugene, I would say 75% of the people I was surrounded with were vegetarians. Whether or not they were conscious of why or had really good arguments for it is debatable. But at that point, I remember reading about the way in which chickens were raised for mass consumption, and that disturbed me. I also think that I cultivated a kind of girlish squeamishness towards raw meat that was sort of false and adopted by just the culture at hand. I have a mother who refuses to touch raw meat anyways, so I think I adopted it from that. But, I was a cusp vegetarian. I still ate chicken, I still ate fish, I still, and I ate very poorly in general. So I wasn't a good vegetarian.
Vegetarianism, of course, does not always mean healthy eating. Often less healthy eating, right?
Often very much so less healthy. And in fact, I became incredibly anemic, not because I didn't have enough meat, but because I didn't supplement with other, sources of iron and that sort of thing. So
Do you remember the meal that you had that brought you back to the non-vegetarian fold? Was there a particular point, or did you realize one day, I don't think I'm vegetarian anymore. I can't really tell myself that.
It's funny you ask, because it was bacon, actually. But the story is that I had moved to Providence, Rhode Island to work in a women's prison teaching writing and theater and art. I was maybe 17, maybe 18. First year of college. And the first day of my job, the warden told me to just go hang out in the maximum security wing of the women's prison. And so I walked in and was totally intimidated and scared. I mean, I'm this little skinny white girl from Oregon, and, I'm surrounded by gang members and other sorts of debatable criminals. But anyways, I walk in, and the first thing that one of the women said to me was, "You're one of those vegetarians, aren't you?"
Oh my God.
And I just thought, I think I have to eat meat in order to be able to do this job.
Right. You got to win their respect.
Yeah, exactly.
Where are you going to teach them anything?
So I went to Louis' Diner in Providence and had a bacon sandwich. So there was no coming to Jesus moment in which I realized meat could be eaten sustainably. It was a cultural moment that inspired me to eat meat again.
Now, it appealed to my sense of incongruity. I mean, before this, I was over on Alberta eating a lavish vegan breakfast. I'm not vegan, but I just felt like if I'm going to be interviewing the founder of the Portland Meat Collective, why not eat vegan in the first half of the day? But vegan eating here does seem to be a big part of the food culture, veganism as well, and vegetarianism. So tell me, I mean, I've read that at the Portland Meat Collective, you do have vegans turn up to classes wondering if I could kill an animal, could I ethically eat it? Does that happens?
Mm-hmm. That has happened, yes. Both vegans and vegetarians. I mean, we've also had vegans show up to protest our classes, so there's two sides to that coin. But yeah, I mean, we have had several vegans come to our classes who do say, I think I would be comfortable, who basically have chosen to be vegans because they don't like the way that meat is produced in America, but who also say, if there's an alternative way to do that, I'd like to find out if I am comfortable with eating meat. Some are not. I mean, some also believe that raising any animals for food is a form of slavery or a form of sort of misguided domestic abuse. I mean, there's all kinds of readings on it. But we also have had several vegans and vegetarians who then say, okay, well, I'm going to raise some rabbits in my backyard and that's the only meat I'm going to eat, or I'm going to buy one pig a year from a farmer I know and that's all the meat I'm going to eat. I mean, and it's interesting because in becoming this person that I am now and doing what I do, I am almost a vegetarian. Like my consumption of meat went down, fivefold, basically, because of it.
As they say, it's less fun when it's your day job.
Well, yes, it's true. But it's actually not that it's less fun. It's that you come to understand meat in a different way. You come to see it as potentially not a commodity. You come to see it as something that you pay good money for and you work hard for, and that takes a lot to get it to your table. And so suddenly it's a privilege as opposed to something that we all should eat or are entitled to eat for every meal, and pay as little money as possible.
How did we get into that screwy mindset in America where it's like we need meat 3 times a day and it needs to be very, very cheap?
That's a long history lesson. Yeah. But, I think 2 things contributed to it. One is that women started working and didn't have, and men started working, not on the farm. And so suddenly there wasn't time to raise an animal and to kill it yourself and butcher it yourself and cure it yourself and prep it yourself. So we wanted quick protein to come to us quickly and cheaply. So, I mean, that's basically that's the basis of industrialization of food right there. And then obviously, I mean, you can get into the subsidization of, crops that feed pigs quickly and how that basically made it hard to make money as a small farmer. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons for it. And so, it was a huge cultural shift that happened over a short period of time.
And this idea of the disconnect that resulted, where we stopped thinking about the animals that we're actually eating. People bring this up as a language issue a lot, like we're not eating a deer, we're eating venison, and so on and so forth, and the names. But, I like to think that if I'm eating a hamburger, I could envision the animal it came from. But I wonder, how much of a disconnect do you see from the students who come into the Portland Meat Collective, and how much do they not know that they don't even realize they didn't know about where their meat comes from and how it comes from that?
A lot. We have Portland is a city of fairly well-informed eaters. So, I would say that at least 60% of the people who come to our class have either, say purchased a half pig from a farmer or buy their meat from a farmer's market and have talked to their farmers and have some sense of like, okay, this pig roamed on a grassy field, it ate corn or whatever. But what's astonishing to me is even those people actually don't have much of a sense of how to use the whole animal. They're still used to pork chops and bacon, and that's it. And they often have some vague memory of a grandparent or a great uncle who would can an entire, deer in their pantry, or who would, make salt pork or bacon or that kind of stuff. But they don't know any of it, and they want to. What question am I answering again?
It sort of doesn't matter, but because we're going down a direction I find interesting, but the sort of the apparent knowledge gaps you see in students. So how much do they not know, and how much do they not know they don't know?
Yeah. So there's the knowledge gap in terms of how to use a whole animal and what parts are edible. By the way, every part other than the nails of a pig basically are, and that's usable too. And then there's also, obviously, all slaughter takes place behind closed doors. It's a very secret process. Most people don't know how an animal is killed or how it's processed, how its hair is taken off. They don't know where it hangs. They don't know who touches it and how many people touch it. So that whole process is a total mystery to most people. And then how to do it yourself is obviously a mystery. And then also, little things like how does breed affect the flavor? What does it mean if an animal eats grass versus corn? How does that affect it? How much does it cost to raise a pig? Why is it so hard for small farmers to make any money whatsoever on that sort of thing? So, the whole everything that gets meat to our table is a mystery to people. Even when you try to solve that mystery, it can be very difficult. It can be very challenging. And so the Portland Meat Collective, to me, is a vehicle to help people figure out the answers to all those questions.
If a student turns up to the Portland Meat Collective and asks, tell me everything I need to know about meat, how important is it to your mind that they kill an animal themselves, I guess, to put it bluntly?
I once believed that we should only eat meat that we kill ourselves. But since I have taught many classes on killing your own animals, I've discovered that there are some people that are better at it than others. Sorry, I just spit on you. I do think that trying to do it once does entirely change your relationship to what you eat. But I do think that it takes a kind of commitment and a willingness to embrace the utter complexity of life and death and power and powerlessness. And there are certain people who understand that and can kill an animal quickly and succinctly and humanely and, not with their eyes closed necessarily, but who can do it well. The goal is to not make the animal suffer. And I think that there are just some people who can't commit to that act. And when you can't commit, the animal's going to suffer. So in some ways, I think that there are certain people that are better at it than others. But I do think that if we all had that experience at least once in our life, that the system that exists wouldn't exist.
It's a question about how humane can you make it? Without getting into too much detail, how do students have to kill an animal? What do they have to actually do physically?
Well, first of all, the idea that killing something is humane is entirely debatable. I mean, there are plenty of people who would argue with me that there's no such thing as humane killing.
Let's say if you're killing, and then humane within that if you're going to kill something.
Well, I think the first thing is quickly. You don't want to prolong it. It needs to happen fast and succinctly and cleanly. And the other thing is that, if you're transporting an animal from the farm it grew up on 500 miles to a slaughter facility that it's never been in, it's going to be stressed. That one could argue causes a certain amount of pain or suffering for an animal. So slaughtering it on the farm that it's familiar with, I think, helps with that. And then, there's plenty of ways to do the deed, but the main thing is committing, basically, and really, coming to terms with the meaning of that for you beforehand and then during. I get a lot of emails from people who don't think that we should be doing what we're doing, who suggest that simply by killing an animal, we are murderers, we enjoy torturing animals, there are people who are that way, but
how many are you? This is a constant stream of how much of the response is like that? I mean, one imagines in Portland there's the stereotype that there's going to be a lot of angry vegetarians. So what actually is the situation with the negative feedback?
It comes and goes. We had a particular instance in January where we actually had rabbits stolen from us before a class, and there was a lot of furor that surrounded all of that, and that's a very long story that I'll tell some other day. But and that really raised the ire of a lot of people, and that lasted for a good 3 or 4 months of death threats on the phone and various kinds of emails that accused us of various things. But I would say, once a week I get someone who calls or emails that, protesting what I'm doing. Some are, I think, totally valid arguments, and some aren't. But, I knew that would happen when I started this. The interesting thing to me is that if I actually was able to sit down in a room with a lot of the people who protest what we do, they'd find that we actually agree on almost every point. I'm just going about their goal in a very different way.
The kind of objections that they voice, I mean, is that something you mostly see in America? I feel like there's a certain American quality to the way that people protest the eating of meat here. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you're the one who studied much more into the cultures of eating. From the travels that I've done, I think that our country, the people in our country, are the most removed from the process. And that's not only meaning, we don't see slaughter on a regular basis, we don't see animals around us, we're not in touch with the agricultural side of it, but it's also, you go to a butcher shop and there's not, homemade salami, there's not duck's feet, there's not pig's heads, there's not evidence of that whole animal and its beingness, basically. So we've managed to create butcher shops in which it's easy to forget that any of this came from an animal. Abstracted butcher shops, exactly, in a sense.
Exactly. So I think that creates a kind of fear and a kind of ill-educated fear, I think, that contributes to the furor over meat eating in America.
Let's talk about a place where they don't seem to have so much of that. You mentioned in France they spend the years they spend before they slaughter an animal, and of course you had to go there to make the transition from food writer to what you are today. Tell me how you arranged that, how France became the place to go to change tracks for you, I guess, if you think of it as a change of track.
There weren't a lot of people here that would teach me. There aren't schools. There aren't butchery schools per se. There are some agricultural, like graduate or undergraduate programs where they'll teach some meat-oriented classes, but there's no formal training for butchers in America. And, as a woman, as an ex-journalist, I found that most of the chefs I approached here in Portland were a little bit suspicious of me, maybe for good reason. I think they weren't sure if I really wanted to learn. I was just looking for a good story.
Oh, they thought you just might have been what you wanted to do an expose or something.
Exactly. But I happen to have had a mentor who just passed away here in Portland, a cooking school instructor who has a lot of ties to France, and he connected me to a woman in Southwest France, an American woman who'd been living there for about 20 years and who had been teaching cooking classes there that really incorporated the notion of like getting to know your farmer, going straight to the source, and then cooking with those ingredients. So she actually hooked me up with a family of butchers, pig farmers there, who had taught a few people who had come through her school, and they embraced me, and they taught me a lot of what I know.
We talk a lot in America about, even if we've never been to France, the infinite superiority of French eating culture and of French food culture, without talking about superiority or inferiority necessarily. What's different about the way they do it there?
Well, I mean, what's not different is that there's industrialization of food happening there as well. I think it's a little younger than it is here. But what's different, especially in terms of meat, is it is butcher shops, even grocery chains that aren't abstracted, in which all the parts are sold of an animal. A kind of, farmers who actually don't just farm, don't just raise animals, but do every part of the process of getting that meat to the table. Those are the farmers that I worked with. So there's the chain of command, if you will, involves less people. Slaughterhouses that are cooperatively owned by small farmers versus huge conglomerates of, a few slaughterhouses that are owned by huge conglomerates. And then a real sense of like, you do pay for what you eat. You should pay for what you eat, and that you should use every part of it and extract as much flavor as you can out of any part of any animal, and make it last. It's like we sort of skipped over. We skipped over that part of our country's history in which we were good at that. We skipped over it pretty quickly in the whole history of America, and that's still alive and well in France.
Were there parts they could use well that even surprised you when you were over there seeing what they could do with every part of the animal?
The head. I mean, I knew you could use the head, but seeing all the things you could do with the head, pig ear salad, stock, head cheese, all pozole, all kinds of different cultures use the head, and it's actually one of the most flavorful parts of the animal. So that was surprising to me, and I think also just learning, what's in each part. Like trotters, they have a lot of gelatin, so if you want a thick stock, you're going to add trotters to your stock. Same with the head. And then what also surprised me is how easily you can read an animal. So butchery is not a series of straight lines. It's a series of readings of the animal's anatomy and its life. So learning that, this muscle moves all the time, and therefore it's going to have more fat running through it, and it's going to have more flavor, and it's going to be tougher, so it's going to need a braise or a roast, versus this, loin that just kind of sits there and hangs out. It's going to be pale. It's not going to have fat inside it. It's not going to taste as strong, but you can cook it easily. So just learning, there's this whole sort of history just lying there in the anatomy of the pig that you can read and figure out how to butcher it yourself.
And do you have a sense of why they in France wouldn't put up with the sort of crappy pork chops we do here? I mean, we take the deal in terms of the cheapness, but it seems like is it a French quality? Is it a European quality? Is it a small country quality that knows you don't have to settle for the absolute bottom of the barrel?
Well, they are settling for the bottom of the barrel now. I mean,
in a widespread way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that. I mean, I'm not a historian, so I can't say why industrialization happened sooner and quicker in America than in Europe, except that we're a younger country and we're much stupider. But, France, industrialization crept in much slower in France, and perhaps because they've had a lot longer to establish a kind of peasant-based food system. They were a lot more resistant to it. And so when I went to France, they were very interested in people like me because they feel like in 10 or 20 years, like their children are going to be doing what I'm doing. They're going to be saying, wait a minute, we kind of screwed up here. Like, how can we go back to what we were doing? Whereas in America, we already realized we screwed up and we're trying to get back to what we're doing.
Yeah, we're now in contrition about it all.
Exactly, yeah.
So how long did you spend in France, and was it a matter of, upon return, figuring out how to take what you knew and bring it to the sort of Portland soil, or how did that work?
I was only in France. I think I was only studying with a family for about 5 weeks, and then I was traveling around France and studying with various people with the help of Kate Hill, the American woman there, for about 2 months. So it was a very short period of time. I mean, I learned a lot, but I by no means was an expert coming back. And really, I came back and wanted to keep learning. I did not have the audacity to start teaching classes right away until about 6 months ago, honestly. And the other thing is that the model that I saw there, the farmers that I worked with, having owned every part of the process of getting meat to the table, that model to me was really interesting. And so I wanted to start seeing how we could close the gap between consumers and farmers, such that the meat doesn't have to go, or the animals and the meat don't have to go through so many hands. And so simultaneously, I thought of the Portland Meat Collective as a school so that I could learn and other people like me could learn, but also as a kind of informal liaison between the consumer and the farmer, such that we could figure out a way for consumers to buy directly from farmers, either kill it themselves, have it slaughtered on the farm, butcher it, and cure it themselves, and there would be no butcher shops, no distributors, no slaughterhouses, no processors involved. And much to my surprise, I found out that Portland is full of people who want to learn how to butcher their own animals. And so, I went up to chefs and butchers and said, hey, if I can get people to pay you to teach them, will you do it? And they said yes.
What were the signs then that, you say to your surprise that this place was full of people who wanted to learn, but what indicated to you that this would be a good place, a suitable place to start a meat collective?
A couple things. I mean, first, like I say, the food consciousness here, I think, is pretty. It's at a high level. We're a pretty food obsessed town. We have for many decades thought very hard about our food and where it comes from and what it tastes like. And part of the main reason for that is that we're so close to farms. I mean, there are urban farms within Portland, but you're also 5-10 minutes away from farms, and then you can keep seeing farms and going to farms for another hour or two. So we're in this incredibly agriculturally rich valley. And so our awareness of farms is quite different than if you live, say, in New York City and you see trucks coming in and out, but you have no idea where they are. And I think, too, when I started the Portland Meat Collective, Portland in general had been going through a kind of restaurant renaissance and food renaissance and farmers renaissance for the past, 10 years at least. And so it was really the perfect time to start something like this.
Tell me, you mentioned studying at NYU and beginning your food writing career in New York City. Tell me, what do you see as most different between the eating cultures of New York City and of Portland? What just jumps out as this, that we treat food differently here than there?
Mm-hmm. I think just in terms of restaurants, there's a real lack of pretension here, and there's a real suspicion of getting too big for your britches, I guess. There's a kind of expectation that everyone should remain just slightly humble, not get too big, which in some ways is Portland's downfall in a way, but
so the just big enough sense.
Yeah, exactly. And I would say Portland has just as many food obsessed people as there are in New York City, but we also don't have as much money, and we don't have quite the same willingness to go so far to get a good burger or whatever. There's a kind of, this is a blue collar town. We're suspicious of anything that's too fancy, and so it's kind of tempered the food world here in an interesting way, whether good or bad, I don't know, but it's meant that our food has remained fairly honest and fairly down to earth.
I do get the sense that a famed New York chef opening a restaurant in Portland, that wouldn't go so well? Maybe it's happened and hasn't gone well. I don't know. Do you see that as something that it wouldn't take in, again, the Portland soil?
There would be a learning curve. Yeah. I mean, I think there's enough sort of like food-obsessed people who are into that sort of fine dining experience in Portland that they would probably embrace it. And there's enough cynicism in Portland about this down-to-earth, like Oregon cooking that they would probably survive for at least a little bit. But they would have to, they'd probably have to tone some things down at first.
What would be the planks of down-to-earth Oregon cooking? I wonder what are the signature qualities of that kind of cuisine?
It involves taking, classic dishes or comfort dishes or simple dishes and just elevating them a little bit. Not so much that you can't recognize it, but enough that it feels special but not unrecognizable. And then, there's not, fine dining here doesn't, there might be a white tablecloth, but it might be wrinkled, like there's not really, the context of dining here is just, it's laid back, it's not, and so I think that contributes to your sense of what you're ordering, even if it's a really expensive dish, you're still having it served at a communal table with benches and, communal wine bottles or whatever.
Does that sort of thing, make the food, make the eating, make that sort of culture in Portland, did it make it when you're doing this more fascinating to write about, that sort of, that self-limitation of certain qualities of the eating here?
Yeah, I ate at a lot of, as a reviewer, I ate at a lot of restaurants who had trouble walking that line, who maybe really did want to be a fine dining establishment, but felt insecure about it, so would kind of tone it down, and then it would just water it down altogether. Or on the opposite end, these sort of like very, very, cheap and low-key sort of places that thought they could get away with food that wasn't that good just because it was Portland food that was, low-key and affordable. So it's a hard line to walk here, I think, and some chefs do it well and some don't. I admire anyone who tries to do it.
I get the sense that in New York City, the restaurant turnover is so enormous. Here, things, if they stick around, they stick around a while. Is that correct?
It seems like it, yeah. I mean, 10 years seems like... There aren't that many restaurants here that have been open 10 years, but there are a lot of restaurants that are on their way to be open for more than 10 years. And I think that's, there was a spat of sort of new media darling restaurants in like 1995 that opened, 3 or 4 of which still survive and will be here for another 10 years. And then, in early 2000, we had a lot of restaurants come and go, but a lot of restaurants stayed, and I think they're here to stay. And they may become chains. The chefs may start to have restaurants in Las Vegas. I don't know, but yeah, it's a little more normal here than in New York City. But at the same time, it's a nickel and dime business, and it's hard to sustain a restaurant anywhere in America, I think.
I've read that the students at the Portland Meat Collective have come from just all walks of life, and I do wonder, at least to the extent that the students come from Portland itself or Oregon, what you've learned about the people here from all the types you've seen come in wanting to know more about meat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I had a hunch when I first started the Portland Meat Collective that I would have a bunch of rather obnoxious hipster foodie somethings, and
do you get those?
Not really.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, but for whatever reason, what we do attracts people who just want honest answers about things and who are ready to do the work to find those answers. And almost everyone coming to the table wants better food for their family or for themselves, and wants more control over it. And that desire spans a lot of different classes, a lot of different races, a lot of different life situations. And I find that really encouraging, because I think that the so-called food movement in America has been accused, and rightfully so, of being rather snooty, rather inaccessible to a lot of different people. And, my classes are not inexpensive, but the people who take them, who often are saving money or I put them on payment plans to be able to pay for it, recognize that the value over time of taking the classes is that you will actually save money, have more control over your food system, and be able to get those answers you're looking for.
This will just show my own distance, my own American distance from the meat I eat. But I've heard things like, I'll raise a pig, I'll butcher it, and eat it for like a year. You can really do that? A pig will last you a long time? Like, how long does an animal last a person? I mean, I don't even know these basic facts, which tells me the listeners might not know either.
Well, I mean, it depends on how you eat it. So if you want to eat meat at the rate that we eat meat in America, which is, basically 3 times a day as the main course, one pig is going to go very quickly. The thing that I teach in my classes is how to do a lot of curing of the animal. So turning stuff into bacon, making prosciutto, making lardo, making coppa, making salamis, sausages, that kind of thing. And when you cure something and you preserve it, when you cure meat and you preserve it, you're making it much richer. So there's more flavor. And therefore you actually eat less of it. You it becomes an accent as opposed to a main course. And if you eat that way, you eat a lot less meat. You eat a lot less meat over a longer period of time. So one pig can actually last you for a year, but that means you're supplementing your beans and your rice and your legumes and your vegetables with little accents of meat.
What surprises students there? What do they learn? And they're like, wait, you can really do that? I can do that myself. Wait, are you sure? Wow, I can actually. You know what I mean? What are the techniques or the abilities they didn't know they had that are really surprising to Portland Meat Collective students?
I think one thing people are surprised by is that when you have good pork that's been raised well and processed well, it can sit out on your kitchen counter for more than 1 second without making you sick or rotting. So there's a real fear, and rightfully so, because we can't really trust our sources of meat. There's a real fear of E. coli, which we should have a real fear of, and of bacteria and mold and meat poisoning us and that kind of thing. And so people are very hesitant to cure meat, to salt it and hang it in their basement, because they think, how could this possibly be?
It's meat. It's got to go in my freezer right this second.
Exactly. But what they don't know is that salt kills bacteria, prevents bacteria from growing, and that, the right temperature and the right levels of humidity also helps suck all that moisture out, which is where bacteria likes to live. And so that, I think, is a profound lesson for people who are in our classes. And that really, again, changes your whole attitude about that animal and about that meat and how it can be used. And it's not this, scary thing. It's not, we're scared of meat. And rightfully so, because it's poisoned us and it's done really bad things to us. But that doesn't go for all meat, That doesn't go for all animals, so...
Now, where are you personally in your own sort of butchery journey? I mean, what remains... What are the frontiers that you yourself would like to explore next, as far as what you can do, what you can make, how you can use meat?
All kinds of things. I mean, I'm still learning how to butcher. I'm still not an expert, and I don't think I ever will be, honestly.
That's the attitude to have. If you think you're an expert, you're probably not very good.
Exactly, yeah. So I'm still, beef is still a mystery to me. I'd never teach beef classes.
We've been talking about pork this whole time. That's true. There's other animals, certainly, and I don't know. What are the challenging animals? What are the ones that's like, well, I'm going to stay away for a little while until I'm better?
I'm not going to stay away. It's just beef is really big, and and there's a lot more muscle groups, and it's a little more challenging. So to me, starting out with pig is sort of the easy thing to do, and then you can move on to beef and these other animals. And it just takes practice. There's not a lot of opportunities for me to have a whole side of beef in front of me. So and when we do the beef classes, they're honestly very complicated, so we don't do them that often. But there's not, they all basically have the same lines running through them between the muscles. It's just that the bigger it gets, the more intimidating it gets. So,
you mentioned the I don't know if popularity is the word, but sort of the way that meat is in vogue right now, and you can buy your $50 burger, your $60 burger. So you can buy these dishes that are somewhat less accessible, perhaps, but very very meat centric right now, and especially in eating centric cities like Portland. And I wonder if It creates a disgusting mental image, the phrase meat bubble, but it seems like there may be a bubble in that sort of thing. And how much is it a goal of a project like the Portland Meat Collective to sort of get past or to ignore the trendy elements of meat and to focus on what is eternal about meat?
That's a good question. I think that my mission is to make it all accessible, such that there's nothing to be afraid of, that you feel capable, but it doesn't feel like something certain special people can do and only them. And that by knowing how to kill an animal, knowing how to skin it, knowing how to take the hair out, knowing how to butcher it, knowing how to cure it, you then have so many more choices. And within those choices, you can decide, well, I'm going to spend this much on this kind of meat or not. I'm going to buy this commodity pig or I'm going to buy an artisanal pig, but we don't have any choice. We buy what's in front of us. But once you take that whole system into your own hands, then you have total control and you can decide what you're willing to pay and what's worth it or not.
Do you think this is something we may have to do anyway? I mean, I don't know. It seems like factory farming is one of those systems like the oil in the ground, like, if you like it, you better enjoy it now because you're probably not going to be doing it later. Do you know what I mean?
I think that we have to feed the world, and at our current rates of consumption, it's hard to think of a world without factory farming and the industrialization of food. And so the only way that is going to go away completely, or at least change drastically, is if our own consumption habits change drastically. And so it's difficult for me to say, like, oh, we just need to change the factory farming system and then everything's going to be okay. I mean, it's a really circular process of education, and you can't, until you change a consumer's knowledge and their own attitude towards food, you can't change the system, but you can't change their consumption habits until you change the system. So it's almost like we need a huge depression or a drought so that we can just completely starve to death and then get it,
Do you see Portland perhaps as a window into for America anyway, a window into sort of the way people will be eating or thinking about food in the future, or is it its own world in that sense? Like, is it a bellwether in that way, as far as food culture and eating and conscientiousness about that, or is Portland just sort of Portland, and America itself may make more Portlandish choices in the future, or it may not?
I think Portland is a good model, but not every city has access to farms like we do, and not every town is located in the same valley as we are, and not every place has the same politics as we do. I do, however, I have traveled to enough other towns that don't have access to farms like we do, who still have plenty of people interested in changing where they get their meat from or where they get their food from.
Who's doing very well? What places are doing very well in that sense?
Well, honestly, any city that has access to farms like we do, because it's easy, it's simple. But, there are so obviously in larger cities, just because there seems to be more of a cultivated consciousness surrounding it. So I think every city and town has to look at their own situation and, sure, pick and pull from New York City or from Portland or from Austin, Texas, or from Missoula, Montana, and figure out what makes sense. I've had people in Baltimore call me and say, I want to start a Baltimore meat collective, and I say, well, how far do you have to drive to get meat, and is it worth it? And if so, what are you willing to do to get there? And so you have to be realistic. Not everywhere is a Berkeley, California, and I think that's been the challenge of the food movement, that should be the challenge for the food movement, is to really recognize all of these different urban and rural landscapes and how they have to create their own systems with the help of other towns and cities, but ultimately by forming it for them and where they're at.
It's maybe too big to ask right at the end, but is it the food movement? Is it a food movement? Are there how do you see it? A lot of small food movements, or is it a unified thing, this food movement we've talked about?
That's a hard question. I don't think it's unified, but I think there's a general direction that everyone's moving towards, and it's going to take a while for all of those little food movements to move together in that direction in a quicker way. That said, it's regional. I don't think that there can be a food movement or the food movement in America. On a policy level, certainly, yes. But in order for the goals of this food movement, whatever it is, to be realized, it has to happen on a regional level, and that those contexts can't be ignored. I mean, one food policy may not make sense in the Midwest, and it may make sense in California. So,
that's why it makes more sense to run a Portland meat collective than a West Coast or American meat collective.
Exactly. Yeah.
I've been coming to you from the Pearl District in Portland, Oregon, sitting outside here with Camas Davis, who runs the Portland Meat Collective, and she was also before a food writer in New York and for the Portland Monthly, and she has become, I would say, to my mind, in my consciousness, one of the emblems of food movement type, the interesting parts of the food movement here in Portland. Camas, thanks so much.
Sure, thank you.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to everyone who backed this season on Kickstarter: Danny Bolson, Brad and Laramie on movies, Paul Doyle, Umberto Grant, Matt Howie, Andrew Hovanek, Mark Hines, Mary Gillander, Eric Graham, Will Graham, John French, Andrew Philippon Jr., Kimberly Hahn, Chris Kay, Andy Cooney, Mark Larson, Rebecca O'Malley, Michael O'Regan, Gail Poole, Blake Riley, Superfan Giovanni, Aidan Nullman, Adam Schaefer, Rob Schultz, Scott Schenker, Cam Smith, Kevin Smokler, Adam Sutherland, TSD, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, and Wayne Wright.